Hello and welcome to Talking to Thinkers with me, Johnny Lyons. In this episode, I shall be talking to Quassim Cassam, Professor of Philosophy at Warwick University. My reason for wishing to interview Professor Cassam is because he is one of those rare examples of a first-class analytic philosopher applying his skills to some of the most urgent and challenging political problems we face today. I hope you enjoy the program. Hello and welcome to Talking to Thinkers.
Hello, Johnny. It's good to be here.
Quassim, if we can begin our interview by me asking you where you were born and grew up.
So I was born in Mombasa in Kenya. It's a kind of sleepy, or at least it was a sleepy seaside town, though I think it's much livelier today than it was then.
And what were your parents like as you were growing up? Were they pushy or were they lax or?
My mother, I think, was fairly lax. My father was pushy, but only in one respect, which was that he was very keen that I should get a proper Marxist education. He was a sort of archetypal armchair Marxist himself. And what he really wanted was to, I suppose, indoctrinate me into his ideology. So, from about the age of, in fact, when I was 11, he gave me various introductory books on Marxism and the selected works of Marx and Engels, which I was instructed to read when I was 11 years old. So I guess that counts as pushy.
And did you become a little Marxist at that age then?
Well, yeah. I mean, I was very much under his influence, and I suppose I wanted to please him. And I had no other sources. I mean, it was just him. And so I actually absorbed a lot of stuff. I mean, half absorbed, a quarter absorbed a lot of Marxist literature. And that was the line that I went down really until I got to Oxford and actually, as part of my undergraduate studies, studied Marx in a kind of systematic way, and then developed views about Marx and Marxism which were divergent from my father's, and this caused enormous problems.
Oh, okay. Well, before we just get to Oxford, maybe if we just spend a little bit more time in Mombasa. So as you say, your mother was more relaxed and your father was quite pushy, at least on the Marxist side. Can you say a little bit about your education in Kenya?
So I was originally sent to a school in Mombasa. So my family are Ismaili Muslims. So Ismailism is a sort of a branch of the Shia branch of Islam, and the Ismailis had their own school in Mombasa called the Aga Khan School. So I was sent there, but for reasons that I can't now reconstruct, I didn't conform. I mean, I refused to learn the Smiley prayers and learn which one was supposed to be able to recite. And I wasn't really an attender of the local mosque. And I think my parents were called in and told, either he does what he's supposed to do, or you're going to have to send him somewhere else. So my parents then sent me to an English prep school in the Kenyan highlands. And most of the students there were the children of expats who'd stayed on after independence. And paradoxically, at prep school, of course, one had to attend chapel every morning and do religious studies, which I did, I believe. So it was rather odd, but the result of that was that I went from going to an Ismaili school and being brought up as an Ismaili to going to an English prep school, and rapidly acquiring an English accent, and really learning about English and European culture and history, and not really learning very much, if anything, about my own culture and history, which in retrospect is a bit unfortunate, I think. But anyway, that's where I was sent to school, and then after that, sent to school in London while my parents were still in Kenya. Initially in the private school system in the UK, and then I got fed up with it and eventually went to a state institution where I did my A levels, which are the exams you do just before you go to university.
So did the English education model, did that eliminate your contrarian spirit, or did it enhance it?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that it didn't eliminate my contrarian spirit, politically speaking. I mean, I retained my adolescent Marxism throughout my school years. I mean, it was rather, in a way, rather sort of incongruous. I mean, I still have this recollection of in an English class when, for some reason, we were just told to read a book for half an hour, and the teacher would wander around and inspect what books we were reading. And he came to my desk, and I was in fact reading one of the volumes of Isaac Deutscher's 3-volume biography of Trotsky. And the teacher did give me a very funny look at that point. But that's what I was doing, and school didn't really make any difference, actually. The thing that really made a difference was starting to study these things in a more systematic way at university, and reading things that were prescribed by my tutors and not prescribed by my father, which is a very different thing.
Okay, so you, as you say, you ended up in the state school, and that led then you went to Oxford. Was Oxford always on the cards? Was that a surprise that you gained entry to Oxford, or were you fairly confident you get in if you applied?
It was an enormous surprise. I mean, one thing I should say is that my record at school was very poor. I mean, my exam results were really undistinguished, and I think wouldn't have got me close to a university, certainly a university like Oxford today. However, in those days, you got into Oxford by doing a special entrance exam, which you took after your school studies had finished. This was an entrance exam that was supposed to test things that were different from, what the standard school exams tested. And I had a lecturer at my state college who said to me, well, why don't you apply to Oxford and, apply to do PPE in Oxford, philosophy, politics, and economics, which would mean doing the entrance exam. And I hadn't really thought about it. And I just said, do you think I should? Does that make sense? And he said to me, well, if you're going to piss about anywhere, you might as well piss about there. And that was the basis on which I sat the entrance exam. And apparently I did well in the entrance exam, much better in Oxford's own entrance exam than I'd done in my A-levels. And in fact, all my answers in the entrance exam were staunchly Marxist. The tutors must have seen something in it, and I was invited for interview and eventually offered a place. But it certainly wasn't the case that I was, one of these people who's always been tipped to go to Oxford or Cambridge, and where going there is just the natural culmination of one's school career. It was absolutely nothing like that. And the college, the College of Further Education, which I attended before going to Oxford, as far as I know, at that point had hardly got anybody into university, let alone into Oxford. It was the College of Further Education in Wandsworth in London, and it mainly really trained people for trades like carpentry and plumbing and so on. And they had a small academic department, but it was most unusual for someone from there to even apply to go to university.
Okay, so quite surprised. That's interesting. Do you remember who was on the interviewing panel at Oxford at that time? Was there any critical people there?
Yeah. So, well, I was interviewed by two colleges. First of all, I was interviewed at St. John's College. Now, this was at a time when Peter Hacker and Gordon Baker were the two philosophy tutors at St. John's. I think Hacker was on the interview panel for that college. I was then also invited for a second interview at another college, at Keble College. And the philosophy tutors there were James Griffin, who subsequently became the White's Professor of Moral Philosophy, and someone else called Richard Hawkins, who's not well known. And I was offered a place, some kind of scholarship by Keble. And so actually under the rules, you had to go to the highest bidder in the Oxford system, and so I went to Keble and was taught philosophy. When I finally got into philosophy, which was some way down the line, I was actually taught mainly by Jim Griffin.
Okay, so you secure a place in Oxford. You're in Keble, and as you said earlier, you did PPE, which is quite a classic Oxford humanities education. How did you find Oxford intellectually and socially?
Socially, absolutely terrifying. I just felt that I didn't belong at all, and found it very hard to fit into the various kind of cliques and social groups that were there. I mean, Keble, my college wasn't really like that, but many colleges, really just seemed to me from the outside to be glorified public schools in the British sense. And although I had in fact been to a public school myself, I hadn't been very happy there, and didn't really relish having the same experience again in Oxford. So I found it socially very tricky. Intellectually, I mean, tremendously exciting. I mean, I certainly didn't go there intending to do much philosophy. That wasn't my main interest, but there was a sense that this was a terrific institution. My politics tutor at Keble was someone very distinguished called Larry Siedentop, who's written about liberalism and Tocqueville and various other things. So I had Siedentop for politics, and I had an economics tutor, not incredibly distinguished economist called Paul Collier, who still producing very important stuff. So he was my economics tutor, and I had Jim Griffin as my main philosophy tutor. So I certainly knew that I was getting a pretty high quality education. And I decided that actually for me, given my kind of social discomfort in Oxford, the only way for me to cope with being there and to survive 3 years was to dedicate myself to working as a mode of coping, really, and as a way to kind of escape from everything else that Oxford had to offer. So I used to actually, set myself a target of working 50 hours a week as an undergraduate, and would actually sort of make a note of how many hours I was doing. And working in Oxford, it doesn't mean going to lectures or having tutorials, because you had very few lectures and very few tutorials. Working meant, sitting in a library and working, and I used to put in hours and hours and hours. But it was actually, I can see now, it was sort of defensive working. I mean, it was working as a way not to have to engage with all the other stuff in Oxford that I just found very disconcerting.
Wow, so quite fastidious in the sense that you mentioned 50 hours a week. You were quite obviously, it was important you got there. So you obviously amassed, even though I imagine Oxford is quite a competitive place for all students, you probably amassed more knowledge than most students at the time if you were doing those sort of hours. Now, you did PPE, which is obviously philosophy, politics, and economics. And you probably knew more about politics, I imagine, than the other two when you went in. Why? I mean, if you were looking at a crystal ball when you went in, you'd probably think he's probably going to specialize in politics, and yet you end up specializing in philosophy. So, what happened in your undergraduate years to make you get more into the philosophy?
Well, within politics, the thing I was interested in was not the study of political institutions, but rather political theory, which of course is, political philosophy. So that was the part of politics that I really wanted to do. I loathed economics. I mean, I realized very quickly that I was no economist. So initially, I would have said that I was going to do mainly politics with philosophy as my subsidiary subject, and that I would do modules that were sort of at the intersection of philosophy and politics. So I would basically do political theory and political philosophy, and in a way that was my sort of first love. And I remember going to some seminars that Charles Taylor gave on Nozick's book, Anarchy, State and Utopia, which had just come out. And I found those Taylor seminars just absolutely inspirational. I thought they were just wonderful. And I remember sitting there thinking, this is what I want to do. And then about sort of halfway through my degree, I came across Peter Strawson's book, Individuals, which was on the reading list for one of my philosophy essays. And chapter 3 of Individuals was on the reading list. So that's the chapter where Strawson talks about the concept of a person and answers the question, what is a person? And I found that just absolutely captivating. I can actually almost remember the moment when I read it. It was on a Saturday evening in Keble College Library, halfway through my second year, when all my pals were out, partying, and there I was, reading Strawson in the college library, and I just found it so intriguing and so interesting, and more challenging in a way, more intellectually challenging and more intellectually satisfying than political philosophy. And so that really resulted in a change of direction. It's not that I lost interest in political philosophy, but it seemed to me now that was at the sort of softer end of philosophy, and that if you wanted to be like a real philosopher, you had to be doing the sort of stuff that Strawson was doing.
Interesting. I mean, and interesting that even in second year, you kind of grabbed onto Strawson, who is obviously he's a very eloquent philosopher, but very complex. And, even postgraduates in philosophy find Strawson difficult, let alone undergraduates. So that was unusual, to say the least, that you actually you caught on to him in second year. And as you say, that kind of introduced you more to the philosophical fundamentals, which kind of rendered political philosophy looking a little bit more superficial. So that was in second year. Did that kind of then stick then as you went into second, third year? Did you get more and more into philosophical fundamentals?
Yeah, absolutely. So something else actually I did in my second year was I did Marxism. So that was one of the modules that was available. And my Marxism tutor was Michael Rosen, who's a very distinguished chap and has written a book on false consciousness and various other things. And so I read a lot of Marx, and I read a lot of sort of Marxian philosophy. So I was reading people like Althusser at the time. And then going into my third year, I decided that, it was clear to me that that philosophy was the thing to do. And if you asked around about, what are regarded as the hardcore philosophy modules, like if you want to do the toughest, most demanding philosophy modules, what would they be? Because I was determined to do those. And the consensus was that the two hardest philosophy modules you could do were Kant, which was focused on the first critique, and a module on Russell and the early Wittgenstein. So I opted to take those two modules, and I did the Russell early Wittgenstein module with Jim Griffin, who we mentioned earlier, and Griffin's first book had in fact been a very good book on Wittgenstein's Tractatus. And I studied Kant with a tutor in another college called Gabrielle Taylor. And when I did those two modules, I really had the feeling that I was now, at the coalface of philosophy. I was doing the real. It was sort of like, graduating from a soft drug to a hard drug. I was now taking the hardest philosophical drugs that you could take. And I loved it. And actually, the thing that I enjoyed most in my undergraduate degree was half a term on the Tractatus with Griffin. That was amazing stuff, and not least because I could see, or thought I could see, all sorts of connections between Wittgenstein and Kant, and I tended at that time to read Wittgenstein as a very Kantian philosopher using effectively Kantian style transcendental arguments in the Tractatus. And so it's this very exciting thing that happens, I think, to most people who get into philosophy, which is you start to see connections between different things, and I found it just tremendously exciting and interesting, and was sort of hooked by my third year.
That's interesting. I knew you had actually worked under James Griffin, but I didn't realize under Gabrielle Taylor as well, who whose book, well, on the virtues is fascinating, and I think one of the more underrated philosophers, or neglected rather. So I had no idea that you'd done Kant under her, so that must have been fascinating. Was there anything you'd like to recall about Gabrielle Taylor?
She was just tremendously nice and tremendously encouraging. I mean, I don't think Kant was really her thing. I mean, she's known for her work on virtues and vices, I guess, and a very well-known paper she wrote on love. She approached she approached Kant really via Strawson and Jonathan Bennett, both of whom had published very influential books on Kant, and we spent a lot of the term kind of wrestling not just with Kant but with Strawson and Bennett. And what was good about the tutorials with her is that there was a sense of both of us kind of working through it together, rather than her telling me things. So that wasn't her style at all. So that was very enjoyable. As I said, I had Griffin on the Tractatus, and I actually had Gordon Baker for philosophy of language, and that was an interesting experience as well. I mean, Baker was one of the Wittgensteinian twins in Oxford, Hacker and Baker. And Baker was very contemptuous of mainstream Oxford philosophy of language, very of the sort of Michael Dummett type. And Baker's technique was he would read out a passage of some philosopher who he disapproved of, and then he would just burst out laughing, as if nothing more needed to be said. So I had quite a sort of a kind of a bit of a motley crew of philosophy tutors, but a good cross section actually of what was around in Oxford at that time.
Yes, well, also an embarrassment of riches, really, as well, compared to a lot of other universities in that regard.
Yeah.
Something you've kind of touched on there, that people that aren't familiar with the Oxbridge educational method is that yes, you go to lectures, but a key part of the whole of their pedagogical approach is one-to-one tutorials. And can you say a little bit about that? Someone who actually was on the receiving and the delivery end.
Well, when I was there, I was doing, as many undergraduates were doing, 2 subjects in any given term. So for each subject that you did, or each module, as you'd call them now, you would be assigned 1 essay per week. So terms are only 8 weeks, but you in the course of a term, you were asked to write 16 essays. And each essay, you were expected to read 6 to 8 book chapters or journal articles. You then wrote the essay, and then you went to the tutorial, and in the tutorial was either one-on-one, or at most you would have one other student in the tutorial. And then the format of the tutorial in those days was that one of you would then read your essay out. And then the tutorial would consist of a discussion of the essay that had just been read out. And if it was a paired tutorial, then the essay that hadn't been read out was then taken in and marked. So the effect of this, you can just imagine how much material you get through. I mean, if you were actually producing 2 essays a week, every week for 8 weeks, and reading a substantial amount of stuff for each essay, you just learned an enormous amount. You absorbed an enormous amount. I mean, the criticism of the Oxford system was that it didn't really encourage you to think very deeply about anything, because you were just having to cover so much and cover it at such speed. And the joke was that really this was the perfect education for someone who was going to go into the civil service and learn to write complex civil service briefs on the basis of comparatively little knowledge, but very efficient research. But that was the system, and by the time I got to finals, so in finals in PP, you were examined on 8 different areas of philosophy, politics, or economics, and for each one you would have written 8 essays. So you just knew an enormous amount of stuff, and I still think to this day that the day on the week in which I took finals, I knew more then than I do now. I mean, it's just hard to kind of get one's mind around how much stuff you have to have at your fingertips to do well. in the Oxford system. I mean, there were lectures, and one was advised to attend lectures. But in those days, going to lectures was, well, I don't remember going to many lectures at all. It was, for me, the focus was sitting in the library, reading all this stuff, taking notes on it, and then basically producing an essay every 3 days throughout term.
Okay, so huge volumes, but also it gave you a real sense of discipline and meeting deadlines, which is obviously important in life as well as philosophy. It just strikes me that method is particularly good for philosophy, more than many other disciplines, because, as you know, some of the greatest works in philosophy are in dialogue, like Plato or Hume, and I think there's a real compatibility between philosophy and dialogue, or and that kind of method. So that's why I was keen to ask you. So it sounds anyway that you think the pros outweigh the cons from that point of view.
Well, I think it depends on the caliber of the student. I mean, I think it's a wonderful system for very good students. It's a very tough system, and not really suitable, I think, for students at the weaker end of the spectrum. I mean, students who just need more help, who can't go away to the library, and read Strawson's Individuals and write an essay about it. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do for the average, 19-year-old, even the average 19-year-old in Oxford and Cambridge. So I think it's a very sort of elitist system. I mean, it's a system that's designed for the sort of academic elite, not really for those who might struggle a bit more.
Yes, and of course it requires a very significant ratio, or an unusual ratio of teachers to students, which most universities don't have. Yeah. Okay, so if we maybe can move on now. You obviously finished your degree in PP, and you then specialized in philosophy. I know from reading other interviews you were thinking about law, but then you decided, no, I want to do philosophy. Can you talk a little bit about then your postgrad and what you focused on?
So I did something called the BPhil, which, despite its title, is a postgraduate qualification. It's a 2-year degree in which you study 3 areas of philosophy and you write a 30,000-word dissertation. So I was allocated Strawson as my supervisor, which was a huge stroke of luck. And it would be usual with the BPhil to do each of the 3 components of the degree with a different supervisor. But at the end of each term with Strawson, he just made it clear that he was expecting to supervise me again the following term. So I ended up being supervised by Strawson for all 6 terms of the BPhil. I didn't really speak to anyone else during that time, and I did philosophical logic, Kant, and metaphysics and epistemology. They were the 3 sort of areas of philosophy that I studied, and I wrote a thesis. My BPhil thesis was on transcendental arguments, which is a style of argumentation, a philosophical argumentation that was sort of invented by Kant and employed by 20th century philosophers like Strawson and perhaps Wittgenstein as well. So I did the BPhil in 2 years, and then under the Oxford system, you could then use your BPhil thesis as the basis for a doctoral thesis. So you could expand it from a 30,000-word BPhil thesis into a 70,000-word doctoral thesis. So I did that, and the process of conversion took me a year, basically. So I continued with on the transcendental arguments theme, and I had a bit of Strawson again, and then he went off on leave, and so he had to find me another supervisor. So after 2.5 years, I finally had someone else to talk to, and my alternative supervisor was David Wiggins.
Wow.
Another, very distinguished Oxford philosopher. But the truth is, I'd actually basically finished the thesis. By the time I got to Wiggins, it was more or less done. And all I remember from those supervisions with Wiggins was Wiggins telling me that Peter had told him that that the thesis was fine and nothing much more needed doing to it. And so we had a few desultory kind of supervisions, but it was really, the whole thing was written under Strawson's supervision. So I did 3 years of graduate work, 2 years for the BPhil, 1 year for the doctorate, and that was it. I was 24, and I'd been through the system.
Interesting. And so, as you say, I mean, and you obviously, Strawson was impressed with you, that he obviously didn't change you, and you obviously were impressed with him that you didn't want another supervisor. And as you say, Wiggins, you at that point you were just almost copper fastening your DPhil.
Yeah.
The just before we leave your DPhil, because I am quite interested in this area, and maybe others would be as well, in transcendental arguments. Can you just give us a sense of what a transcendental argument is? Because it does go against kind of common sense views of the world.
Yeah. So classically, transcendental arguments are understood as anti-skeptical arguments. So the skeptic is someone who says something like, you can never know if there are minds other than your own, or you can never know if there are mind-independent objects out there in the world. So the transcendental argument tries to refute skepticism of that form in the following way. It says, let's start off with something that even you, the skeptic, accept. Right? So even you, the skeptic, believe that you know that you have a mind, that you are able to know your own mental states. Maybe you don't know other people's mental states, but you agree that you know your own mental states. So then the argument proceeds by saying that actually, in order for you to know even something about your own mind, you have to know about other minds. In order for you to know something about your own states of consciousness, you have to know something about the existence of objects that are distinct from your states of consciousness. So you start off with a premise which is concerned with something that seems genuinely indubitable, genuinely not open to skeptical doubt, and say, well, for that to be the case, something else also has to be the case. So in individuals, chapter 3 of individuals, which that was a thing that got me turned on to philosophy. Strawson's argument there is, to put it very crudely, in order for you to have knowledge of your own mind, you have to have knowledge of minds that are not your own. So if a skeptic says, well, I know my own mind, but I don't know if there are any minds other than my own, Strawson's reply to that is to say, well, no, that's not coherent. Right? Because if you genuinely didn't know of the existence of minds other than your own, you wouldn't even be able to know anything about your own mind. So all the work in these arguments is done by the premise that connects the thing that you can't doubt with the thing that the skeptic tries to doubt. So the question there would be, well, why would anybody think that in order for you to have knowledge of your own mind, you have to have knowledge of other minds? That's really the crux of these arguments. And that was really, looking at that issue was the crux of my doctoral thesis.
Okay, so can I ask you a crude question and ask, do you think there's more to be said in favor of the transcendental argument than against it? Or what was your thesis arguing at the time?
Well, essentially the thesis was arguing that these are jolly interesting arguments, but they don't work.
Okay.
That was it. So it was sort of anti-transcendental argument, and in a way, critical of the transcendental arguments that were prominent in the 20th century. So although Kant is credited with having invented transcendental arguments, it's actually quite hard to find kind of straightforward transcendental arguments in his own work. The transcendental arguments that are in a way the most famous ones and the most widely discussed ones are actually associated with Strawson. So Strawson has a whole bunch of transcendental arguments in individuals, and in a later book called The Bounds of Sense, which is a kind of commentary on Kant. So those were those were the transcendental arguments that I focused on, and obviously, in a way, being supervised by Strawson, it meant that I could sort of, discuss his arguments with him. But I can't say that I found it very rewarding. I mean, he wasn't in the least bit inclined to defend his own position. I mean, he was perfectly happy to accept that these arguments didn't work, and his own thinking had moved on anyway. So I was being supervised by him at the time when he was writing a book called Skepticism and Naturalism, in which he essentially abandons Kantian-style transcendental arguments and adopts a much more Humean response to skepticism. So the Humean response doesn't try to argue with the skeptic, but just says, you're trying to get us to question beliefs which, just as a matter of human nature, we can't question. So skepticism is kind of, in a way, it's pointless, if it's pointless to argue against it. And that was Strawson's line, at that time. And of course, I mean, occasionally I'd ask him, what he'd meant when he'd said something in some earlier work of his. And he would say, well, I don't know, that was 20 years ago, or that was 30 years ago. And I can sort of understand that now. I mean, at the time, as a young person, one tended to think that, these great philosophers, would have perfect memory of what they'd said at any time in their careers and would be able to reconstruct their thought processes. And of course, that's not true. I mean, and he would often, when I would ask him these questions, would sit back in his armchair, sipping his sherry and smoking his cigarette in a very elegant way that he smoked, and would be very kind of receptive to my criticisms and objections, and showed no inclination to defend them. So what I needed was really pushback against what I was saying, and what I got from Strawson was not pushback, but just kind of encouragement, and a lot of, well, that's right, yes, it said in his own way, rather than, yes, but, someone might say this or might say that in response to your arguments. So it was a rather strange experience. I mean, I went through my graduate degree with a lot of Strawson kind of telling me that I was right, and nobody telling me that I was wrong or giving me reasons for thinking that I might be wrong. And that is unusual.
And it sounds like you had doubts. You had doubts about the validity of your own ideas, which it sounds like you were wanted to be tested more than Strawson was testing you.
Yeah, and the whole thing was bizarre. I mean, when I got to my DPhil, my doctoral viva, in those days you could have a viva. I mean, it was normal for Oxford vivas to have both examiners from Oxford, whereas nowadays, you have to have one external examiner. And my two examiners were Ralph Walker and Simon Blackburn. And the viva was in the depths of a summer in 1985. And I felt my ideas had never really been tested up to that point. So I entered the room, and essentially they said to me at the beginning that I'd passed. And one of them, I can't remember which one it was, I think it might have been Simon, saying that, well, we like this very much, and there's nothing to worry about, but anyway, you're here now, so we need to talk about this. And the viva took 45 minutes, and it was pretty desultory. And I didn't really get any pushback there either. And so there was a tremendous sense of anticlimax. I mean, I walked out of the examination schools in the depths of August, when Oxford is populated by tourists and nobody else, and felt that no one had really kind of challenged what I was saying. In retrospect, I mean, not that I could face reading that thing again, but I'm pretty sure that there are many things that are open to dispute in that thesis, and that could have been disputed, and would have been disputed by more argumentative supervisors and examiners. But I didn't get that at all.
Fascinating. Well, I mean, I think moving on a little bit now, I mean, what that seems to, though, have established is your interest in epistemology, or what was otherwise referred to as the philosophy of knowledge, and you then focused on that. Yeah, you were obviously you became an Oxford Don. You became a philosophy tutor. I think it was in Wadham College, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So you're on the kind of track, which must have been nice, and you're focusing on, as I say, epistemology. Your first book is called Self and the World, and can you give us a sense of what that is trying to do, or what that was trying to do? What was your problem, and what was your solution?
Yeah. So the real question that book was asking was, under what conditions is it possible for us to be aware of ourselves? So self-awareness is has been taken since Descartes' time, at least, as a sort of primitive in philosophy. The one thing that we have is awareness of ourselves, of our own states of mind, for example, and then other kinds of awareness or knowledge become problematic. So my thesis was asking the question, under what conditions is it possible for us to be aware of ourselves, to be aware of our own states of mind? And the claim was that you can't be aware of your own states of mind unless you are aware of yourself as an embodied being. So the idea was that I mean, Descartes, of course, thought that each of us has a body. So Descartes was a dualist. So he thought that a person was a compound of mind and body. The true self, the real self, was an immaterial, non-physical substance called a soul, and the soul occupied a body, but the body was just something that you had. It was something that you owned or that you possessed. It wasn't really part of you. It wasn't part of your true self. And the point of the Self and World book was to try and defend the view that consciousness was much more deeply embodied than the Cartesian picture allowed. So in a way, the approach was one that's more familiar from so-called continental philosophy. It was an attempt to defend the idea that consciousness has to be of necessity embodied consciousness. You have to be aware of yourself as a physical, a corporeal, a flesh and blood object in a world of physical objects. And this is integral to your ability to be aware of yourself at all. So it was a kind of transcendental argument, actually. I mean, you can think of it as a sort of, so rather perversely, having demonstrated in my doctoral thesis that transcendental arguments couldn't possibly work, my first book was in fact then a complex transcendental argument for the importance of embodiment, the importance of thinking of your own body as a part of you and not just a kind of vessel or a container for your soul.
And how was that book? Well, were you happy with that book at the end? And did it get the reception you were hoping for?
I don't think it got the reception that I was hoping for. I mean, I think the reviews of it were respectful, but I think the main criticism of it was that it was too Strawsonian. And I can see why people said that, but it's actually not correct. I mean, all this stuff about embodiment is not there in Strawson in the way in which it's there in Self and World. There's a lot of stuff about bodily self-awareness in Self and World, which just isn't there in Strawson. So I thought that it wasn't understood in the way that I understood it. I don't think it's had a huge amount of influence, although I mean people still seem to be citing it. And there was a conference on it 2 or 3 years ago to mark the 20th anniversary of its publication, which forced me to reread it. And on rereading it, I thought that it wasn't terrible. It wasn't terrible, put it that way. I mean, as a first book, I think it was fine.
It is interesting, though, that, I mean, just as a kind of a more general comment about philosophy, the subject, you're bringing up things, that where, a lot of the time we get things wrong. You're talking there about Strawson, even that, but I wrote that 20 years ago. Not only could he not remember, but he suspected it was probably wrong. That makes philosophy very, very different to most other disciplines where, if you're talking to a scientist, they won the Nobel Prize or whatever, they're probably going to want to defend their position, and it's probably not going to change that much. And that goes for a lot of other disciplines, especially in the sciences and even in some of the humanities or social sciences. Whereas philosophy doesn't work like that, does it? I mean, something could be very, very interesting and yet full of errors.
And I think there's a kind of deep insight in that observation of Strawson's, that, for something to be philosophically interesting and worthwhile, it doesn't have to be, true. I mean, Kant is a great philosopher who said a lot of things that I would say were, kind of highly implausible, but nevertheless illuminating.
Yes. Yes.
So I think that's one of the things about philosophy. But having said that, I think it's also true that philosophers differ enormously in their temperaments. I mean, there's a kind of philosopher, and I think these are in the majority, who writes something and then feels the need to really defend it, to die in the last ditch in defense of their own view. And a lot of philosophy is like that. You put something out there in the world in the form of an article or a book, people then attack it, and then you try and defend it. There's another kind of philosopher, and I think Strawson was really the archetype of this. Someone who writes something that they believe in at the time, but once it's out there, it's out there. If they think it's being unjustly criticized, they'll defend it, but they have no interest in defending their views per se. They're quite comfortable with the idea that other people might not agree with it, or there might be flaws in it. And I think, temperamentally, I'm very much a philosopher of the second kind, and I'm sure Strawson was a great influence on me in that respect. That of course, I want the stuff I do to be well thought of, including well thought of by myself. But the reality is that you're going to get a lot of flack in philosophy, and you yourself may well change your view of your own work, and I think that's just something one has to be comfortable with, and one just needs to kind of move on. And I tend to look back on stuff I've written in the past in a very sort of detached way. I kind of there are some interests, but I don't feel the need to kind of prove to anybody else that I was right in what I said. Often that's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's I see philosophers like Strawson and maybe Hilary Putnam and perhaps yourself as the way I see it is like the Miles Davis of philosophy, where Miles Davis for me did some of his greatest, produced some of his greatest music in the 50s with Kind of Blue, but then he had no interest in doing that again, and part of me just wanted to carry on doing that, but that was the nature of his genius, that he had no interest in resting on his laurels or reproducing something that just happened to be very successful. And I think there's a creative side to philosophy in the way that you get with other arts that you don't get perhaps in the sciences, and as I say, in some of the humanities, where you feel if you've achieved something, you just want to polish it. And I know there's two schools, but I think more interesting philosophers tend to change their mind as they go through their career. So that thanks for sharing those aspects of that book. And we then, if we could just kind of move on with the trajectory of your career, you'd obviously been an Oxford Don for maybe about 17, 20 years. You then get appointed to a professorship in University College London, which you take up about 2005, 2006. You're there for a while, and then you move to Cambridge. Can you talk a little bit about why you moved and what that meant for your career?
Yeah, so in 2004, I'd been in Oxford for 25 years unbroken. First as an undergraduate, then a postgraduate, and then a Don. I realized that it was perfectly feasible for me to just continue in Oxford and to until retirement. But I thought that wasn't what I wanted to do. I mean, I didn't want to get to the end of my life having arrived somewhere when I was 18 and not left until I retired. There was no chance really of my getting a professorship in Oxford at the time. And there was a professorship on offer at UCL, which had a very good department. So I applied and I got it, and I went to UCL. I thought then that UCL was where I would stay. I mean, I had an apartment in London, walking distance from UCL. The UCL department was very good, and everything seemed settled. I wasn't aware at the time that the Knightsbridge professorship in Cambridge was about to be advertised. And it was advertised soon after I arrived at UCL. I didn't apply for it and didn't even know that it had been advertised, but was then approached by someone on behalf of the committee, the electoral board for the Knightsbridge professorship, asking if I would apply, and indicating that the outcome could well be positive if I did apply. Many of my friends urged me not to apply. They thought that I wouldn't like it in Cambridge and I wouldn't get on well there, and that UCL was, the place for me. But I just thought, well, let's just see what happens. So I applied for the Knightsbridge professorship, was offered it, and then felt I couldn't turn it down. I mean, the Knightsbridge chair is one of these great chairs of British philosophy that's been around for a long time, and it's not the sort of thing that you turn down. So it seemed to me. So I left UCL, very prematurely after just 2 years, and went to Cambridge, and then discovered that all my friends and colleagues who told me that I wouldn't like it in Cambridge, that they had spoken the truth. I didn't like it. For a whole variety of reasons. It just didn't agree with me, we weren't a good fit. We weren't a good match. It became clear to me that I needed to go elsewhere. That I wouldn't be happy if I stayed on in Cambridge. And Warwick then came in with an offer that I accepted, and that was in 2009. And so I've now been in Warwick for 11 years, and I think in many ways these have been the happiest years of my life, professionally speaking, and certainly the most productive years of my life. So although I still get asked this question, whenever I go abroad, particularly in Germany, and give a talk, the first question that I get asked over dinner is, how could you leave Cambridge to go to Warwick? Well, I can see that from the outside it might seem a little strange, but from a kind of personal angle, it made perfect sense, and it's worked out. So I have no regrets about that.
Well, as someone that spent a while in Cambridge myself as a student, it wasn't the happiest time of my life. So I have my own reasons for that, but it just seemed to me far too competitive and intellectually not the most encouraging of places, let me put it that way. Even though there was great people there and there were some great individuals, the place itself didn't do it for me either. So as you say, you moved to Warwick and you've stayed there. So obviously you've been happy there. I imagine more than just on a philosophical level. Mm. But if we keep to the philosophy side of things, when you moved there, your next book then turned into be the possibility of knowledge, which I think you wrote when you were in Warwick. Is that right, or was that?
That was a Cambridge book. That was a Cambridge.
Oh, that was a Cambridge book. Yeah, okay, so apologies.
I can't remember. I think it came out in 2007, so it came out when I was in Cambridge, but actually would probably have been written when I was at UCL. So. So there was that book, which was again about sort of Kantian epistemology. So Kant's method in the Critique of Pure Reason is to say, let's start off with the premise that something is possible, that mathematics is possible, that natural science is possible, that knowledge is possible, and let's ask the question: how are these things possible? So these are called how possible questions. So you start off with a piece of knowledge that whose reality is taken for granted, and then you ask the question: how is that kind of knowledge possible? So the possibility of knowledge, which is my second book, was really all about these how possible questions. About how do you answer a how possible question? What is it that a how possible question is even looking for? So that was. I think it's an interesting topic. So that book came out, I think, before I went to Warwick, and then when I went to Warwick, I then started working on self-knowledge, which culminated in a book called Self-Knowledge for Humans.
Yes. Just before we get onto that, because the thing I liked about you, or found interesting about your book on the possibility of knowledge, was that, as you say, anyone who reads Kant's first critique, it's well, my experience of it, it's both fascinating and intimidating. And also a lot of the time he's a clear writer, it's just so dense. And whatever about Strawson being a compressed writer, I mean, Kant just leaves him looking like Jackanory almost, So but what I found interesting about that book, The Possibility of Knowledge, is it actually shows the kind of your skills as an analytic philosopher in full flow there, because Kant kind of creates a big problem and then you started breaking it into chunks, which I think is very interesting. That's something that analytic philosophers do quite in a very interesting way. They analyze, they break down a problem, and all of a sudden it looks more manageable than it might have been before when you just look at the problem holistically. if I've got your book right, could you say something a little bit about that general technique that analytic philosophers bring to a problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a good description of it. I mean, it's breaking something down into manageable parts, and you can think of it as, I mean, supposing you're confronted with a car engine, or it's a very kind of complex piece of kit, and what you want to know is, how does this work? And so the model is that, well, if you really want to know how it works, take it apart, look at how the different bits of it fit together, and the role that's played by the different parts of it. So the idea is that you sort of do the same thing with philosophical arguments. So in Kant, there are arguments of just astounding complexity and difficulty, and the trick is to kind of break these arguments down into their individual components, and then look at each component in turn, and how the components are supposed to fit together. And if you can do that, you sort of begin to get a sense of what's going on in the argument. And the possibility of knowledge was really addressing a question that Kant himself doesn't address, which is, I mean, Kant is very interested in the question, how is such and such a thing possible? How is mathematical knowledge possible? But the one question he doesn't really properly address is, how is his own philosophy possible? How is the kind of philosophy that he does possible itself? What does it involve? Really, it's a matter of trying to work out how these Kantian arguments or these Kantian explanations function, and trying to extract from them something of lasting philosophical value. And that was the real sort of challenge of the possibility of knowledge. I think it's in some ways the book, the most neglected of all my books, although I actually do think there are good things in it. And there is a further discussion of transcendental arguments in it as well. So it sort of connects with things that I've been thinking about for a long time.